All right, we're in the home stretch. Part 3. All right, let's move on. This is a little bit different organization of this slide. I kind of give it in kind of a plain Jane description here. But we've seen all of these events and where everything kind of falls in place, starting with the deportations. Remember, those who go into exile, it all starts in 605, all the way up to the fall of Jerusalem. So we've got Daniel being deported and going into exile. Just Jerusalem's destroyed. We have the faithful remnant. But then we have this transition, which is another world event that we didn't talk about earlier. But, you know, if we think of the Lord as being sovereign over world events and sovereign over the nations of the world, there's this very important switch. Persia conquers Babylon. And 1 year later, Cyrus II, what we've talked about, and his decree is issued in 538 BC. And then we have the leadership, or those who are in charge of specific tasks and what's going on back in Jerusalem, starting with Zerubbabel. He leads the first group back, and the focus is on the temple. And then we have Darius the First, and that activity there going on, parallel with Ezra and the book of Daniel. So there's overlap there. The temple's completed, and we saw the influence that Zechariah and Haggai have, and leading up to its completion in 520 BC. Esther's reign under the Persian king Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, there is parallel, and in between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. And then we have Ezra come back as a priest in 457 and leading up to Nehemiah. So they're each leading groups coming back and accomplishing with a focus on different specific things or tasks. So that's another way of looking at it. After the time of Artaxerxes the first, this is the Persian king during the time of Nehemiah, we have a series of Persian kings that come after. You don't have to remember this for the final exam, but if you're interested in factoids about history, we have Xerxes II, who comes after Artaxerxes. Then we have Darius II. Then we have Artaxerxes II. Then we have Artaxerxes III, Artaxerxes IV, and then finally Darius III. So a lot of names to keep track of, first, second, and third, and in this case 4. And then we have the Macedonians conquering the Persians, and that ends the Persian rule, which introduces us into the the whole Greek period, right? That comes later. So the Persians are finally defeated in 330 BC. So that's what we've got after that in terms of history. There's our deep thought picture for the book of Nehemiah. Everybody see it? The deep thought picture there. You got it figured out, Austin?
I've seen this before. It's cheating.
Oh, it's cheating. No, that's
it's
Nehemiah. Yeah, there you go. So he's rebuilding the walls, and that's captured there. All right. So the book of Nehemiah is going to cover that 25-year period, right around 457 all the way up to about 432 or 433 BC. Parallel to Nehemiah's time would be the active prophet Malachi, or if you want to say, the famous Italian prophet Malachi. Thank you. You've heard that before. You'll hear that again in prophets class. With the focus on the rebuilding of the walls. So, like Daniel behind the scenes, Mordecai behind the scenes, we see that the prophet Nehemiah, I'm not the prophet, but the leader Nehemiah is a significant Israelite working behind the scenes before he's called by God to make his transition back home to Jerusalem. And he's rising in leadership responsibility in the court of King Artaxerxes I, the Persian ruler. All right, and he hears some bad news. Let's see what he has here. Haven't had Christopher. Could you read? There you are. Start reading for us in chapter 1, verses 1 through 3.
Where's Nehemiah, the son of
Achaliah.
Now it happened in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, the capital, that Hananiah, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and survived the captivity, and about Jerusalem. They said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach. And the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire.
Okay, so you remember when we were talking back in Ezra chapter 4 and that whole discussion of the insertion that was kind of out of sequence with regards to the narrative timeline? Probably parallel to that account in Ezra chapter 4 verses 6 through 23, which remember was inserted by Ezra kind of out of sequence, but parallel to that event that's described is probably what we have going on here with this recognition that Nehemiah is hearing about this opposition that's going on back home in Jerusalem. So that's interesting, I think. And we learn that in that context, if we remember, we learned that Artaxerxes' decree that he issues puts a stop to the repairs that are going on the walls. So this is what we have going on here. And interestingly, we see another very significant response in terms of leadership that we have here. And this gets into kind of a first-hand account, personal side to Nehemiah. We learn a lot about Nehemiah, and we see this first account come through with his use of me and I as we're really getting into the personal experience of the author himself. And we saw how Ezra is going to grieve and respond when he hears about the intermarrying that's going on. So Nehemiah's going to respond here in a very similar way with grieving, fasting, and prayer. And let's see what his prayer looks like here. I want to look at, we see the grieving and how he responds in verse 4. It came about when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, I beseech thee. So here's his prayer. We'll look at it a little bit more in detail here. I beseech thee, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who preserves the covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Notice it's an appeal, right, to who God is. Let thine ear now be attentive, and thine eyes open to hear and see the prayer of thy servant, which I am praying before thee now, day and night, on behalf of the sons of Israel, thy servants, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we've sinned against you or thee. I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against thee, and have not kept thy commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances which thou didst command thy servant Moses. Remember the word which thou didst command thy servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. I want to keep reading down through verse 9. But if you return, if you repent, right, to me, and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the most remote parts of the heavens, what will I do? I'll gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen to cause my name to dwell there. And they are thy servants and thy people, whom thou didst redeem by thy great power and by thy strong hand. O Lord, I beseech thee, may thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant and the prayer of thy servants who delight to revere or fear thy name, to make thy servant successful today, and grant him compassion before this man, that is the king of Persia. Pretty powerful prayer, isn't it? Yeah. You break it down in verses 5 through 6a, or the first part of verse 6, focus on an appeal to who God is. That's a great place to start. Model your prayer life after Nehemiah's prayer. So verse 5 through 6a, an appeal to who God is. Start there. Who is God in light of my situation, right? He's the God who keeps his loving kindness, his covenant promises. His character doesn't change, Verse 6b through 7, Nehemiah acknowledges sin in the covenants, the specific covenant violations with regards to the teaching of Moses. What did Moses teach us to do and not to do? So Nehemiah goes back to that. He knew his Bible, not unlike Ezra. And we see in verses 8 through 9, he's actually quoting Scripture back to God, as if God needed to be reminded. It's more of, it's a validation of what God has already said. And in verse 8, we see him quoting Leviticus 26, verse 33. And in verse 9, Nehemiah is quoting Deuteronomy 30, verses 2 through 4, and his reference to the idea of the name, a place that I'll put my name. That's an allusion to Deuteronomy 12, verse 5. So he's very mindful of the Torah. And, where and when do you learn to pray like that? I get back to my David point. I'm sorry to keep beating a dead horse, but somebody prepared Nehemiah for such a time as this. Where did he get that spiritual preparation? Growing up in that small town church without a building, but mind you, that was meeting in exile. That's where, under the teaching ministry of Ezekiel and those that followed the prophet Ezekiel. That's where he learns this. So it's an important, somebody taught him to pray like this. And, it's that idea here. We talked about that. I don't think, what's interesting, it kind of reminds me of my experience. I haven't been able to go back recently because of the recent developments, but for a while there, I had been going to China. I've been teaching members in the underground church. So it's not unlike you can still have church happening, even though it's underground and illegal in that context. But I met a lot of very spiritual, very Bible literate people in that community. So there's instruction and teaching going on, even though you can't meet legally in a building to have church. So it's interesting. It reminds me of that experience. And perhaps the exiles who were in Babylon and then later Persia, they were meeting in a similar type situation, probably in homes. Speculation, I don't know if they were actually allowed to have an official building. They were probably not allowed to meet in large groups because the Persians didn't want to have any kind of rebel riots going on. So, it's interesting, a similar parallel thing going on in certain countries around the world where there's persecution. The government does not want Christians to get together and unite. So they're persecuted. Don't meet in large groups. If you do, you get on our radar, then, as my mother used to say, no, I'm not going to say it. I might get in trouble. So how can something that my mom used to say? Something my mom used to say, when trouble comes, she would say when the El Toro poo-poo would hit the fan. El Toro poo-poo? Yeah, don't fill it in. Yeah, it's funny. I laughed whenever I heard it. So that's, and what happens in the result? Chapter 2, how does the Lord respond to Nehemiah's prayer? Let's see here. Who would like to read that? I'm just going to, anybody? Any volunteers? Can I get chapter 2, verse, gosh, do I have to call on somebody? Half the class is not here. So, Mr. Ji-Hoon, I'll have you read. You were smiling up there. I could tell you were eager to read. So chapter 2, start reading there. How does God respond to Nehemiah's prayer? Just start reading in chapter 2, verse 1.
So, and it came about in the month Nisan. Go ahead.
Nisan, yeah.
In the 12th year of King Artaxerxes. That wine was filled again, and I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tomb, lies desolate, and its gates have been consumed by fire?" The king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. I said to the king, "If it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tomb, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time.
So he remembers and recalls. There's the answer to prayer. You might think of this as a personal decree from King King Artaxerxes. And, the details here, not only that, look at the fullness of the answer to prayer. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest. Send a letter to him, that he may give timbers and beams and gates for the fortress, which is going to be built by the temple, the wall around the city. He's providing building materials as an answer to prayer for Nehemiah. And so, unfortunately, you see there, it's not going to be easy. We see in verse 10, immediately, like we've seen before, we've seen these waves of opposition, right? In verse 10, when Sanballat the Hornite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about it, it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the shalom or welfare of the sons of Israel. So we've got opposition just around the corner. And so what happens is, as a result, Nehemiah is going to inspect the walls when he gets to Jerusalem, but with a high degree of secrecy. So let's take a look at this in verse 11. I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days, and I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem, and there was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding. So he's low-key here, right? Yeah, under cover of darkness. So I went out at night by the valley gate in the direction of the Dragon's Well. These are specific locations around the city, and on the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were consumed or burned down by fire. Then I passed on to the foundation gate, to the king's pool, but there was no place for my mount to pass. The rubble was so high. I went up by night and to the ravine and inspected the wall. Then I entered the valley gate again, and I returned. And he's like an engineer. That's what I like about Nehemiah. I'm an engineer. I'm a mechanical engineer. I can identify to these details, specific geographical locations around. And he's setting this thing up. He's getting the plan together. And he reports back to the people, the officials, in verse 17. He says, you see the bad situation we are in, that Jerusalem is desolate and its gates burned by fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer be a reproach. And I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words, which he had spoken to me. Then they said, okay, you've convinced us. Let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. I mean, that's leadership, isn't it? You see leadership just screaming off the page. It's an excellent study of how you can lead people to accomplish a spiritual agenda. God's behind it, reminder. Based on prayer, by example, and as we'll see, more details to come, lots of interesting things. But that's, again, we're going to see immediate opposition. So what happens when Sanballat, the Hornite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite officials, when they hear? And not only that, but Geshem, the Arab, heard it. They mocked us and they despised us in verse 19. And they said, what is this thing you are doing? I like to be kind of whiny with the opposition voice in this context. Are you rebelling against the king? So I answered them and said, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, we his servants, and we'll arise and build. But you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. So get lost. I love these guys. They keep coming back, and, their opposition fire gets turned up a little bit each time, each round that they have. All right, but Nehemiah is going to, remind them, well, you're talking about an earthly king, but let me remind you in verse 20, there's another king involved in this project. He's namely the King of Kings, and he's got our back. Nehemiah, as a spiritual leader, knows that. You've got to be convinced, I think, that when you're called to ministry, for example, we've talked about that before, but you fall back on these things when the opposition comes. And it's going to come, You just don't get pushed back and off the cliff. You're falling back against something that is immovable, and that's oftentimes our calling to ministry, or the fact that we know that God's called us to do something. That's what we need in this day and age. It's So I think that's interesting. So let's see here. Then in chapter 3, it's kind of interesting. We have another list or with regards to who the builders of the walls are. Is a long list of different people, and you see it in chapter 3 when we won't cover it, but some of them have specific skill sets. They're coming from particular families, and they have different job descriptions based on who they are and what they're good at. And it's important to know who's who when you're working on a project like this. You don't want any spies showing up, right? You don't want anybody who's from the opposition group, especially when you're working on something of this importance. I'll give you an illustration of this. I keep coming back to my experience in China. This is what happened. I don't know if I've told this before. Maybe I did in one of my previous classes if you've been with me for a while. But in China, we went in and I was teaching and we went into a classroom. And one of the things that I remember is this guy's very helpful. We were all walking in, and typically you don't walk in a large cluster of people. You walk in 2 by 2. And then you're in the room, and the room starts to fill up with people. These are going to be the students. And I'm going to teach Old Testament survey. And I did it in a whole week. Can you believe that? And the room starts to fill up. And I was going to use a whiteboard about this size, right? That big in this room. And it was being set up. And somebody was doing that. And I was looking out of the corner of my eye, and then another man comes in, and he introduces himself, and he makes a beeline to me. And he starts talking to me and asking me questions like, well, who are you and why are you here? So I start to play dumb because I've been trained to do this. And I just started talking about, well, I teach history, and I'm interested in character development. That's why I'm here, meeting with my friends. I'm not sure who everybody is here. I don't know anybody's name, And we have a very vague conversation. And after a while, I kind of noticed that the room was getting a little bit slim. People had started to leave. And it's interesting that the last 3 people in the room was me talking to this guy, and the guy that was setting up the whiteboard was then in the process of tearing it down. And he says, it's your turn to leave. And I said, okay, come with me. He said, come with me. And we leave the room, and we leave this guy there all by himself. Yeah? So about 30 minutes later, I'm some other location, and we start class. And everybody that was there before had found their way halfway across town to the other location. And we have our instruction session, but it was very interesting. Very guarded, and necessarily so. This particular group of people were passionate about learning God's word, but have to do it very carefully, and they have to know who's on the invitation list. And later I asked a few questions, and nobody in the room knew who this guy was. Don't really know to this day. So, it's kind of a parallel situation. But it was that important for the group who had come back under the leadership of Nehemiah. But it's important for the organizational genius behind Nehemiah. It's interesting in terms of application. How far do we go in our churches? This is just an open question. I don't necessarily have the right answer. But looking at something like this, how important it is to have accurate records of membership in our church. Some churches go with a membership covenant where membership responsibilities are defined. Some churches don't like that. It's too restrictive. It gets into the conversation of, is it necessary for us in our churches to know who is who and who's not? This is just somebody who's just walked in off the street. We're not going to ask them to do childcare for that day. We don't even know who they are. These days, you have to have a background check on people that work with our children, right? You have to have these things checked out. Otherwise, you run into all kinds of liabilities and issues. So it's an interesting thing. We have to be, I think, to some degree, we have to be organized like Nehemiah and careful with regards to who our members are and who's doing what in the church, particularly with regards to qualifications and skills and abilities and in our case, character qualifications as well. That's an important thing that we learned from Nehemiah. All right, I'll let you all sort that out on your own. Chapter 4, we move ahead. So this opposition comes in by way of criticism. And Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall. He became furious and very angry and mocked the Jews. And he spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy men of Samaria. Remember, they're coming down from just across the border in the north. What are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore it for themselves? Can they offer sacrifices? Can they finish it in a day? Can they revive the stones from this dusty rubble, even the burnt ones? Now Tobiah, the Ammonite, was near him and said in even a higher whiny voice, even what they are building, if a fox should jump on it, he would break their stone wall down. You know, it's just kind of like, this is kid stuff, you know. My dad's bigger than your dad. Let's see. Hear, O our God. Notice there's the capital G-O-D, not L-O-R-D, because this is Tobiah speaking. How we're despised. Return their reproach on their own heads and give them up for plunder in a land of captivity. But, he goes on and on and on. So this is the opposition. And it's interesting in that despite this opposition, we see Nehemiah being very focused and intentional in leading the charge. And as we'll see, maybe before we finish today, navigating through some very difficult times. Verse 14, we see him offering encouragement. And that's part of the strategy when you're a spiritual leader. Verse 14. Well, let's see. So, what I want to do is look at the beginning of this, where this opposition goes. It gets more intense. You think that they just kind of, over time, just kind of quiet down and go away. But we prayed to our God in verse 9, and because of them we set up a guard against them day and night. Thus in Judah it was said, the strength of the burden bearers is failing, yet there's much rubbish. We ourselves are unable to rebuild the walls. And our enemies said, they will not know or see until we are coming, and then we'll kill them and put a stop to their work. And it came about when the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, they will come up against us from every place where you turned. And I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall and exposed places. And I stationed the people and families with swords, spears, and bows. So you've got this, what Nehemiah is doing here. You probably have heard of this before. He gets very creative, and he's equipping the workers on the walls with the tools necessary for the rebuilding part, but now he's also adding the tools necessary for the let's protect ourselves part. Swords and spears and bows with shovels and axes, So that's a stroke of genius, Part of spiritual leadership is being in tune with the challenges of those that are doing the work and making sure they have the proper equipping. And in our ministry context, that goes with, the volunteers that work for us, for example. They're not getting paid anything if they're volunteers, but one thing we can do is train them and equip them with the skills necessary to get the job done and enjoy it and feel like they're, contributing positively to kingdom building work, right, in our churches. So that's the equivalent that we have. So this is the encouragement. And in verse 14, when I saw their fear, Nehemiah says, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Quote, don't be afraid of them. Nehemiah says, remember the Lord, capital L, that's just the Lord, who is great and awesome. That's our God. And fight for your brothers, your sons and your daughters, your wives, and your houses. So reminding our people when things get a little bit, when the pushback comes, reminding our people, this is the spiritual cause. This is what we're fighting for. This is our goal, This is what we're shooting after. And it helps the people. So what happens after this in verses 15, we won't read it, down through verse 23, verse 21. So we carried on with the work, half of them holding spears from dawn until the stars appeared, At that time I also said to the people, let each man with his servant spend the night within Jerusalem, so that they may be a guard for us by night and a laborer by day. So there's this rotation of work. Some can rest, some can work. Might slow the overall project down a little bit, but it's resource management. It's people, managing people the right way. So you're not overworking and overtaxing. You're sharing the load and sharing the responsibilities. So that's an important thing that we see going on here. All right, let's press on just a little bit more and then we'll call it a day. But the problems continue for Nehemiah. Isn't that real life? I mean, even in the midst of all of these advances, Nehemiah is solving problems along the way. But what happens, The problems continue. You put one fire out and then another fire springs up, right? Isn't that ministry? So what's the next problem that Nehemiah solves? Chapter 5. Let's see what happens. Chapter 5. Let's have Jessica, could you read for us? Chapter 5, verses 1 through 5.
Now there arose a great outcry of the people and their wives against their Jewish brothers. For there were those who said, with our sons and our daughters we are many, so let us get grain, that we may eat and keep alive. There were also those who said, we are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses to get grain because of the famine. And there were those who said, we have borrowed money for the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards. Now our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers. Our children are as their children. Yet we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have already been enslaved. But it is not in our power to help it, for other men have our fields and our vineyards.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you knew that or not, but right in the middle of all of this rebuilding project with the opposition against the rebuilding of the walls, you've got this happen. There's a famine, and you've got this escalation of the problem, because if you've got all of the focus now on who's the workforce, and what are they doing, and how are they spending most of their time during the day, it's doing what? Yeah, not working in the field. So they've got pressure now on the economy with regards to harvesting of crops and the necessary production of food. So there was a short period in my life where I liked to play a particular computer game, and it involved kind of like micromanaging all of the details of building a kingdom, like castles. What?
SimCity.
Not SimCity. It had to do with knights, kind of that medieval period. And so, you'd start with building your castle, and all the while you'd have to manage your workers. You'd put some of them in the field, and they'd work in the field, and you'd see over each cycle, look at all the crops that I grew. And then you can turn your wood, and you can make weapons and get ready for your next conquest. But if you mismanaged your kingdom, you'd never get to the place of feeding your people. And guess what they did eventually? They rebelled. Pardon?
Oregon Trail?
Not the Oregon Trail. I never played that game. I just used it as an example last week. Yeah. Yes, sir. So this is Nehemiah's challenge. He's having to manage these problems. I'll come right back to you. I just want to finish my thought here, because this is where I think I'm going to, we'll see. The problem here is we have to keep our households fed. We're having to mortgage and sell our belongings in order to pay the bills. This is what they're saying in modern terms. We're borrowing money in order to pay the Persian king tax, which that was still around. Remember, they're still being watched and managed by the Persian Empire, having to pay tax. So as a result, they're having to offer their sons and daughters as servants and slaves, selling them to work or loaning them or whatever. And it's this is really a problem. They're trying to solve their own problem, not do it in a proper way. And this becomes the problem for Nehemiah in verse 6. In his response in verse 6, he says in first person, I was very angry when I heard their outcry in these words. So I had to get some consultation going on. This is another leadership skill. Sometimes you need the advice and the counsel of others. In verse 7, I consulted within myself and contended. Actually, he doesn't go very far. I was thinking that, no, he consults with himself and then he contends. see, with the nobles and the rulers, and says to them, you are exacting tax, you're exacting usury, each from his brother. And therefore, I held a great assembly against them. So let's go to your question in the back right now. Yeah, before I move on too far.
Okay, I want to take us back to chapter 4 of Nehemiah.
Okay.
And it's on verse 13 and 16.
Verse 13?
Yeah.
Yes.
Where it says, then I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, the exposed places, and I stationed the people in families with their sword, spears, and bow.
The exposed places are just like bare places. Yeah.
I want to ask a question that where did they get all these weapons from?
Oh, with all the what?
The weapons. Where did they get it from? Because if you look at 1 Samuel, can we go to 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 19 to 21?
Okay. 1 Samuel, what is it? 13?
Yes, 1 Samuel 13, 19 to 21.
Okay. 13, 19 through 21.
Yeah.
Well, that was the context there when they're warring. Saul is warring against the Philistines.
At that point in time, they didn't have weapons.
They're not having the big army, yeah. So they're a little handicapped.
It's interesting to see how Nehemiah was able to make these people to get all these weapons to fight.
Yes. I'm trying to remember if there was a reference to weapon building earlier in the context here. Or if I can't remember if there's listed some of the special skills of the people here in the where he lists out all the builders of the walls and all the skilled sets. People, if they're people who are building weapons. I'd have to look at that again. There's skilled people, perfumers and wall experts, goldsmiths. So there's metal workers. People are working with metal who have the skill sets, who are being listed as workers, authorized workers. So I might build an argument that direction. So yeah, there's going to be weapon building going on, and he's going to oversee that. It may not be specifically listed in the narrative that we have, but I'd have to look at it a little more closely. But yeah, there's situations a lot different. They're going to have weapons because they need them, because Nehemiah has identified the need to have weapons with their tools, right? So it's going to happen because he's going to make it happen. He's going to organize it to happen. All right. Let's break. I'm about ready to fall over right now. All right. Thanks for your attention. We covered a lot of ground. We'll pick up right here and see how Nehemiah solves this problem next week.